Welcome. I'm Mubashar Hasan, your host of the show, The Melting Pot. In this educational program, I'm going to hold discussion on myriad of issues, including culture, politics, history, art, films, current affairs, and book reviews with experts and practitioners. The guest of the first show is Dr. Rainer Ebert. He is at the Oxford Center of Animal Ethics, originally from Germany. Dr. Ebert completed a Master in Philosophy and a Doctor of Philosophy in Rice University, USA. Dr. Ebert is an incoming visiting fellow at the Center of Research and Ethics at University of Montreal, Canada. So, our topic of discussion today is should animals have the same right as humans? Dr. Ebert, welcome to the show. What do you think? Should animals have the same rights as humans?
Well, let me start by thanking you for having me on what promises to be a very interesting and important show and giving me a chance to share my ideas. Um, I, s- my argument about animals has its origins in my doctoral research. In my doctoral thesis, I tried to answer the question of why it is wrong to kill individuals like you and I. Now, that seems like a trivial question, right? We all agree that it is seriously morally wrong to kill people like you and me. But interestingly, I think there is no explanation in the philosophical literature of why that is. And that got me thinking about certain fundamental issues in ethics. Now, as I said, most of us agree that killing one person is just as seriously wrong as killing any other person. And that is because we believe that we are all equal in the sense that we all matter the same, right? That we all count the same. So here I'm just talking about human beings so far. Now, the philosophical problem is to explain why that is. Why is it that we all count the same, that we are all equal in that important moral sense? Given that in so many ways we are not equal, right? Some of us are stronger than others, some of us are more talented than others, some of us are more intelligent than others, and so on. There's really not much um, in which we are equal as an empirical matter. So that is the philosophical problem that I try to address in my dissertation. Now, interestingly, to connect this to animals, if you ask people why they think that animals have a lesser moral status, they will appeal to those very qualities, right? They will say animals are not rational, they're less intelligent, and so on, which is curious, right? We don't think those differences in rationality, intelligence, talent, and so on matter among people. But when asked to justify why we treat animals as lesser beings, we appeal to those very qualities. So that's quite curious. Now, I think there's one thing that all of us do have in common. There is one empirical quality that we all have equally, and that is an appropriate basis for our moral equality, and that is the fact that we are conscious. Now, in a sense, of course, consciousness varies just as much as those other empirical properties I've been talking about, intelligence and so on, right? Some of us have a richer experience uh, than others. Some of us have more sophisticated thoughts um, than others, and so on. So if you think about the contents of our experiences, there is great variety among people as well, just like there's variety in rationality, talent, and so on. However, there's another sense, and I think that sense is important, in which we are equally conscious. We're equal in that all of us equally have a unique point of view. We all have a what is sometimes called a subjectivity. We are all centers of consciousness. We are someone's rather than some things. And that is equally true of all of us, right? You have a certain view on the world. There's someone at home in you, so to say. You're a center of consciousness, a subjectivity, and so am I. So that is equally true of you, me, and anybody else. And I think philosophically, that's the only or the most promising basis of moral equality that I can think of. Now, if the capacity for consciousness is the basis of our moral equality, what grounds our equal rights and so on, then certain animals must be afforded the same rights, the same equality, for the same reasons if we want to be logically consistent, right? If you and I are morally equal and therefore have certain rights, because we are equally centers of consciousness, because we're equally subjects with a unique point of view, then animals who have a unique point of view and who are subjects and out of consciousness must be recognized as our equals with certain fundamental rights as well for the same reason. And as it turns out, there are many such animals. While it is not clear scientifically where exactly to draw the line, we have very strong evidence that at least mammals, birds, probably reptiles, amphibians, are conscious beings just like us, and in my opinion, therefore, deserve some of the same rights we have. Now, the tagline here says, should animals have the same rights as humans? Now, nobody believes that all animals should have the very same rights we do. Animal rights advocates don't advocate for voting rights for dogs or for the right of snakes to gain admission to university. Those are not the rights we're talking about. We are talking about fundamental rights that protect interests that are essential to a being's welfare, such as the right to life and the right to bodily integrity. So those very fundamental rights that are immediate expressions of our moral equality.
Fascinating discussion. Um, I was reading one of your articles, and in one of that articles, you have mentioned that the Aristotle's idea of hierarchy of being was behind the idea that human beings are different than other species. You seem to challenge that point. Are you essentially arguing Aristotle was wrong?
So Aristotle's worldview, both was his scientific worldview, was rather simplistic. Well, we can't fault him for that. That was more than 2,000 years ago, of course. He had this idea that nature is organized in a discrete hierarchy of beings. So you can think of it as boxes, right? So he had like one box for human beings at the top. Then there's another box that contains animals. Well, maybe one box like for each species. And then one step down further, there's plants and then inanimate objects. So he thought of nature as a hierarchy where animals are there to serve humans, plants are there to sustain animals, and so on. And he thought that each of those boxes is defined by certain essential characteristics. Say, humans are rational. They're defined by their capacity for rational thought, whereas a dog is defined by him or her having four legs, behaving in a certain way. So there are certain characteristics that define what it is to be a dog, and that is different from the definition of a cow or a cat, and so on. So the idea here is that there's a hierarchy of different categories, like well-defined categories of being, um, and those those boundaries between those boxes, between those categories, are fixed and clear. So that's the scientific side of things. And then I also already talked a little bit about the moral kind of things that kind of corresponded to that, where the idea is that animals, non-human animals, are there to serve humans and so on. Now, I think that Aristotle was wrong both morally and as a matter of empirical science. And we can easily understand that and agree to that when it comes to his views about women, for example, right? Let's talk about that first to illustrate what I'm challenging. Aristotle wrote that although women have a deliberative faculty, it is, and I wrote it down to not misquote him, he wrote that the deliberative faculty of women is, quote, without authority. So that, in his view, females require male supervision. He wrote that, quote, the relation of male to female is naturally that of the superior to the inferior, of the ruling to the ruled. So that was his view of women. So in that hierarchy, women are inferior to men because supposedly they are less rational. Now, we know today, of course, that he was wrong from a scientific perspective, right? Women are no less rational than men. But importantly, he was also morally wrong, right? Even if it was true that women were less rational, which it is not, but even if it was true, that would not mean that they're less deserving of respectful treatment, right? One just doesn't follow from the other. We afford the same respect, the same fundamental right to people who are less rational than we are. We afford the same fundamental right to small children that we afford to adults. So rationality is not it's not a requirement to have a certain level of rationality to be deserving of fundamental respect and rights. So he was wrong, I would argue, both scientifically and morally. And just like he was wrong about women and also about slavery, by the way, he famously defended slavery, just like he was wrong about people of different races and of the opposite sex, he was wrong about animals. And here again, also both scientifically and morally. Scientifically, we now know, at least since the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species, that nature is not organized in neatly separated categories of being. Rather, all life on Earth is interrelated. And those characteristics that Aristotle thought defined one category or the other, in fact, come in degree and can be found in varying degrees throughout nature. For example, if we think about rationality, it is not true that all human beings are wholly rational and all other animals are wholly irrational. Rather, some people are more rational, some are less rational, and we can find varying degrees of rationality in individuals that belong to other species as well. There is fascinating research about the ability of certain great apes to use tools, right, or engage in other rational conduct. So we can find rationality in animals as well. We could find pretty much any quality that we find in humans, in other animals as well, to varying degrees. And there are individuals of other species that are superior in certain ways to some individuals in our species. So the real picture is much more complicated than what Aristotle would have us believe. It's much more messy and complex, right? We cannot think of nature as this neatly compartmentalized system, right, where we can draw clear lines. That just isn't true anymore. So that's the scientific side of things. I think he was wrong about that. Again, we can't fault him to that. He didn't know what we know today, right? Darwin hasn't had not done his research yet back then. So he was wrong about that, just like he was wrong about women, and that's okay, right? That's how science works. We make progress over the centuries, and he was also wrong morally, even if it was true that all animals were, like, let's say, less rational than all people, which it isn't. But even if it was true, that would not settle the question of whether they deserve moral equality and certain fundamental rights.
So that was an interesting and I think a bit convincing argument, because this is the process of science. We
Right.
progress and from mistakes or from shortcomings, and that is okay. Maybe it's a good time to revisit some of the comments we have received, and then we'll come back to our program. So Niladri Chatterjee from University of Oslo says, fantastic. So it's a good feedback that we're having a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Niladri. Um, Professor Abdus Samad from Jagannath University says, wonderful. And Taj Hashmi says, if I recall correctly, Aristotle believed women had no souls. So he is again supporting your point of view. So moving on. You talked about evolution theory and Darwin and how he challenged the idea of Aristotelian argument about hierarchy. And I think there is a concept called natural selection within that evolutionary theory. So could you tell us what is natural selection and how it shapes and influences your argument?
Right. So natural selection is one of the basic principles of evolution. It's a natural process that results in the adaptation of an organism to its environment. And it does so by means of selectively reproducing changes in its genotype or genetic constitution. Now, what's important to understand about natural selection is that it is a very slow and continuous process, right? It takes place over a very long period of time. And these changes cannot be seen immediately. That's why you won't see much evolution happen during your lifetime, right? It's a very long, long process. Which is why those characteristics I have been talking about, those characteristics that people often associate with the supposed superiority of humanity, such as rationality, language ability, and so on, come in degrees, right? Those are characteristics or capacities that developed gradually over a long period of time through evolution. And that is exactly why we find these capacities to varying degrees in other species as well. It was not like in the biblical story, right? That like we were like created in an instant, equipped with rationality. Rather, that's a trait that we acquired slowly over thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And it speaks to the point I was trying to make in my previous answer, and that has always also been made by Darwin itself, which is that differences between us and other animal species are not, that's the way Darwin put it, are not differences in kind, but rather are not like categorical differences, but are rather differences in degree, which I think makes it very hard, if not impossible, to draw the philosophical line that traditional morality would have us draw between us and other animals. Because that line, right, that Aristotle also invoked, that line that separates those who are equal in a moral sense and have certain fundamental rights from those who haven't, that imaginary line, right, in our moral worldview, simply has no counterpart in empirical reality. And that is a problem. That is a philosophical problem. because our moral intuitions are still very much rooted in a scientific worldview that is outdated. Scientifically, we have moved on from Aristotle, right? From that old view that nature comes in neatly separated compartments, categories. We have moved on from that. We now understand that we evolved through a long natural process and that there's no such clear lines. Whereas on the moral side, most people today still have that intuition that there's something special about human beings. And you see, there's just like a mismatch between our scientific view of the world on the one hand and our moral view of the world on the other hand. And that's one of the, I think, one of the fundamental challenges of moral philosophy today, to try to find back to some sort of equilibrium again, right? To reimagine our moral view on the world so as to bring it in accordance, right? To make it fit with our scientific view of the world that has evolved. And I believe the way to do that is to recognize that there is no such line between us and other animals. There's no such moral line. Rather, conscious animals, just like us, are deserving of respect and fundamental rights, just like we are. I can't hear you.
So I'm gonna revisit some of the comments I received, and then we're gonna go back to our discussion. So
Right.
Mustafa Shafi from Sydney, from Australia, he said is watching. He's a great political science, Bangladeshi political scientist. Nitin Srivastava, a journalist, a very well-known journalist from India, says, "Good show." Thank you, Nitin, for watching.
Thank you very much.
Iftekhar Mahmood, another journalist, very good environmental journalist in Bangladesh, also says, "Good to see you watching." My friend Bishash, just thumbs up. Yo, man, thumbs up back to you. Um, then there are few new comments. So we would so one is from Niladri. I think we're going to come back to that, not now. So he says it would be interesting if we can have a brief discussion only if the time and opportunity allows for it, to talk about, I think, the concept of animal rights by the established religions. It's a very good comment, and I think, to the best of Ebert's knowledge, he would be comfortable to discuss it at a later point, right?
Sure.
Yeah, good. And then my friend Skip Khan, he's a rapper in Bangladesh. He says the only law rule in the animal kingdom is survival of the fittest. A carnivore will take a baby calf away and eat it. Human rights stop this in our civilization. Law preventing kidnaps. So if you're talking about animal rights, shouldn't it be only limited poaching or visual tortures? Because we need lab rats for medicines, herbivores for food, and so many other things. Also, another argument: why leave out plants? Asking this not for the sake of argument, rather because I failed to answer this. So I think these are good. Some of them are good questions, and we are gonna come back to these. My friend Ben Schoenfeld from Bangkok says, "Smile, man." Yeah, I was here. It is, and yeah, okay. Neeladri Murray Hill from Scotland says, "Greetings from Scotland. I'm enjoying your broadcast. Thank you for being there, Murray. You have been a great friend, and I guess thank you for Reina too from from DC." Uh, And Russell Mahmoud says, good to see ya. Okay, so we agreed that we're gonna come back to some of the comments later on. I want to move forward with the planned discussion first, and if time permits, we're gonna touch up on those. So it seems to me that you are raising a question about traditional morality, and I mean, being a non-philosophy background, it took uh, a while for me to understand that's a philosophical argument. So there is a difference between morality, the way we understand morality is, and the philosophical argument of morality. And it would be useful if you share your knowledge on what is morality for human being in general without philosophical and technical ideas. Then you could comment on what traditional morality is in philosophical literature, and what you are saying, how that is different than traditional morality, and how morality works within our social, legal, and political realm. So there are like three questions. One is what a school going boy, what do you say to a school going boy, or or a university going person, that what morality is. And that needs to be, I would appreciate if you detach it from the philosophical literature of morality. Second is the what you said about traditional morality within the philosophical literature, and how you distinguish your argument from traditional morality. You have talked about that a bit, but it would be good to revisit on that. And third one is in our world today, how morality transcends and translates within our social, legal, and political realm. Thank you.
Right. Oh, thank you very much for that question, because that allows me to clear up some concepts that are frequently confused. And I'll try to explain without using much philosophical jargon, even though we'll have to use some of the words which I'll explain. So morality is, I guess, the body of principles and theories that explain what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, and guide our conduct, our behavior accordingly. Now, what we do in moral philosophy, which is a branch of philosophy, moral philosophy is sometimes also called ethics, right? So what we do in ethics is we systematically study what is right and what is wrong, and what is good and what is bad, right? These are two different um, different fields of inquiry. The question of what is right and wrong concerns human conduct, human behavior, whereas the question of what is good and bad concerns states of affairs, right? For example, pain is widely considered bad, and so on. Now, what is moral? So let me focus on the first part. The second part is called value theory. That's not that interesting in what we are talking about. What we are talking about, what is right and what is wrong, right? I argue that it's wrong to treat animals in certain ways. Now, what is right and what is wrong, what is moral, what is immoral, must be distinguished from what is illegal and legal and illegal on the one hand, and what is, let's say, culturally, socially acceptable and unacceptable on the other hand. So these are three different concepts that we need to be careful to distinguish. Let me give you some examples. Take breaking a promise, right? I'll make a promise to you today that tomorrow I'll send you an email with some information that you requested, and I fail to do so. I think we would all agree that what I did, unless I have a very good excuse, right? I ended up in an emergency room or something unforeseen happened. But if I just forget about it, or I'm careless, or I decide just not to keep my promise, we would all agree that would be immoral. That would be morally inappropriate. I would have wronged you in that I didn't keep that promise. However, it wouldn't be illegal, right? Me making a promise to you here and now does not establish a legal obligation like a contract would, right? It would be a different matter if we wrote down a contract in which I obligate myself to send you that email tomorrow. But if there is no such contract, the mere promise does not establish a legal obligation. Therefore, breaking it is not illegal, but it is immoral. So here we have an example of behavior that is immoral but not illegal. And there's many more examples. Maybe a more drastic example is cheating on your spouse. In most countries, cheating on your wife or husband is perfectly legal. There is exceptions to that, but I think in most countries that does not constitute a crime or any other criminal offense. Whereas most people agree such behavior is immoral. So again, we have an example of something being legal but immoral. There's also examples of things that are illegal but morally permissible. Let me again start with a trivial example and then move on to one that is more drastic maybe. Imagine you are alone at night on a highway, right? For example, here in the US, we have these highways that go for dozens or even hundreds of miles straight, let's say through the desert. I can see far ahead. I have my light on. I can see miles ahead. There is no person and no animal either anywhere in sight. I'm alone on that highway. And I go a few miles per hour over the speed limit. Now, that clearly is illegal, but I think it's an open question of whether that would be immoral, right? I'm not putting anybody at risk. I have clear sight of miles ahead. There's nobody I could possibly harm. So it would be hard to argue that it is immoral in that situation to speed. Yet it is clearly illegal. There's a speed limit and I'm exceeding it. If that doesn't convince you, let me give you a more drastic, maybe a historical example. There were times when interracial marriage and slavery, say, were legal. Again, here in the United States, there were times when slavery was perfectly legal. Most of what happened in Nazi Germany in the last century was legal as well, yet clearly immoral. So there are things that are legal and immoral, and there are things that are illegal but morally acceptable, which shows that those are two different concepts. And moral philosophy is concerned not with the legality of things, that's what lawyers think about and people who study the law, and what is moral and what is immoral. What is moral and immoral also needs to be distinguished from what is culturally, socially, or religiously acceptable or unacceptable. Again, we can think of many examples of things that are acceptable in society, but immoral. To give a contemporary example, there are still many forms of subtle, at least like subtle forms of sexism that are widely acceptable in many societies, but that are immoral considering the fact that men and women are equal. Or for a clear example, we again can look at historical examples. Like slavery. Slavery was not only legal, it was socially, culturally, in many instances, even religiously acceptable in many societies throughout history. Yet we now understand that those practices were immoral. So again, there's a distinction between what is morally right or wrong and what is culturally, socially, religiously acceptable or unacceptable. So that in a nutshell is moral philosophy, right? We don't think about what is legal or illegal, what is socially acceptable. Those are questions for lawyers to study and for anthropologists maybe, right? Or religious studies, religious studies scholars or sociologists. So those people study those other questions. What philosophers focus on is the moral question of what is right and what is wrong. And we are trying to find answers to moral questions by means of argument. So that's where that word systematic that I used earlier, right? It's the systematic study of right and wrong. It's not merely stating your opinion about your moral opinion about a certain issue. It's defending that opinion using logic, using facts, constructing arguments, defending those arguments against objections people make, just like our commentators already did, right? So what we're doing here is moral philosophy, right? I present an argument, people will object, they'll ask questions, they will try to show that my perspective is mistaken in one way or another, and then I have the option of either defending my position or modifying it in light of that objection, right? That also happens often, and that's what should happen, right? That's how we make progress.
That's a fair point. We need to move on. So let me take a short break from
Sure.
philosophy and turn my focus on you, the philosopher. Would you share with the audience why you wanted to be a philosopher? Was it your childhood dream? Tell us more about it.
So I was always interested, as far as I can remember, in fundamental questions about reality. And that's why I started out studying both physics, particularly theoretical physics, and philosophy at Heidelberg University in Germany. That's why I did my undergrad. That is, by the way, not an uncommon combination, since both theoretical physics and philosophy as subjects are rather abstract and very logical. So they have more in common than people commonly assume. So I did both in my undergrad, and then I had to decide whether to go to graduate school in physics or philosophy. And I chose philosophy, sorry. So I chose philosophy with an emphasis on moral philosophy or ethics, in part because I think it's of more practical importance than what I did for my thesis in physics, which was string theory, which is like highly theoretical. It's a lot of fun, it's very interesting, but I thought I can make more of a difference in the real world, so to say, in philosophy. And that is because many of the most pressing issues that we are facing today, think of climate change, our relationship with nature generally, and non-human animals in particular, what we're talking about today, immigration, abortion, criminal justice, human rights, and so on. All of these issues, which are important and very much controversial, have significant moral components. And I think philosophers are in a position to make a unique contribution to those debates that we are having in the public sphere. Now, the contribution I think we philosophers are uniquely positioned to make are not in that we have all the answers, right? We don't. Philosophers have no more answers than anybody else. But what philosophers can contribute is that they can help clarify what's at issue, and they can help people achieve a better understanding of what the possible positions with regard to certain issues are and what the underlying arguments and values are that
Yeah.
drive some position on an issue. And I think that is very important, that it can help our public discourse, right, to be more efficient. Like if everyone has a better understanding of what's at stake, right, what underlies a certain position, what the arguments are for and against a certain practice or policy, I think we can have a more productive public discourse that then will lead to better decisions for us as a society. So that's what motivated me to go into philosophy, and I then applied to graduate school. I ended up at Rice University in Texas, as you mentioned earlier, where I got my PhD. I wrote my dissertation under the American political philosopher George Scheer on the wrongness of killing, as I had mentioned, with a particular focus on the morality of killing animals. I then taught at a community college in Texas for a while and was lucky enough to get a postdoctoral research position at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, where I worked with Thaddeus Metz, who is a great philosopher and a very generous mentor. And after that, I taught for 2 years at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, East Africa, which also was a great experience. And I learned a lot about how people from different cultures, different backgrounds feel about the issues I care about. And I just moved back to North America, where I'll start a research fellowship at the Center for Research and Ethics in Montreal, Canada, in September. So that's where I am now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was quite informative, and I think, like me, our audience also got a full picture behind the idea of that you're putting forward. So, who was the idea generator? So, I think that was very useful and helpful. So, those who just tuned in, I'm holding a fascinating discussion with Dr. Rainer Ebert. We are discussing, we are exploring whether animals should have the same right as humans. You can share your thoughts and comments here. Before going to our next section, let me share that next week I'm going to hold a discussion with Dr. James Gomez, regional director of the Asia Center on hate speech in Southeast Asia. So details. So please tune in. The times are on your screen, and don't forget to tune in. It's a really interesting and topical issue we're going to discuss. Now let us shift our focus from philosophy to the legal and political side of this topic. Let me bring back our guest, Dr. Rainer Ebert. We So, my next question, and also if you want to know more about Rainer Ebert, here is his website. Just type in your internet and Explorer or Google Chrome, and Rainer has all the information about him there. Um, Coming back to our discussion, there are a few more comments. I would address those comments later on. Um, So I want to focus the discussion from philosophy um, to the legal and political side of the topic, because it seemed to me philosophers are always, and please do not consider it by any way a criticism, but it's like that you give an idea and then you move on. But people from political and legal side needs to make those idea viable. I mean, that's how the world we constructed today. So my first question is, if hypothetically, if you have the power to change the world the way you want to, what are the key political measures you would need to take to ensure animals and humans share similar rights? Um, So just give us some brief political views, like what are the key points you would take to change the world the way you want to see the world?
So I have to say, I'm not a politician, neither am I a political scientist. So I'm afraid I can't say too much about strategies to achieve political goals, but I can tell you what I think the goals should be. So maybe let's start with that. So, in my view, like if we take that idea seriously, that certain non human animals are our moral equals and have fundamental rights like the right to life, the right to bodily integrity, and the right to liberty, just like we do, that would mean that in a morally ideal world, there is no commercial animal agriculture. I think that would be the most important and the most far-reaching consequence of my philosophy. because most of our, like the majority of our interaction with animals is at the dinner table or the lunch table, right? We kill about 2,000 animals per second globally for food, and that doesn't even include seafood, right? Just land animals. So that is where most of our interaction with animals take place. It's in the way we eat. So in a morally ideal world, there would be no commercial animal agriculture, and people would be vegans. That means people would not consume meat or any other animal products. Because killing animals for food or confining animals to harvest their milk or eggs is not consistent with the idea that they should be respected as our equals, since we would not impose similar burdens on humans either for trivial benefits such as those derived from consuming animal products. So if we take that idea seriously, that animals have certain fundamental rights, we cannot kill, confine, mistreat them for the production of food, and people would have to be vegan. Another consequence of my view is that animals should not be used in science and entertainment. So, in a morally ideal world, there would be no animal research, with maybe very few exceptions, right? There are some forms of animal research that do not involve harm to animals, such as merely observational research, right? It will still be possible to go into the wild and observe the behavior of animals in their natural environment. So there's a few exceptions, but a harmful animal research that results in the suffering or death of animals would have to cease. And so would the use of animals in entertainment, such as circuses and zoos. Equally, any other way of interacting with animals that violates their rights would have to stop. So that is the moral idea. Now, how do we get there? I don't know, but I'm not sure how we can achieve that. But as a layman in that realm, I suspect that much will have to do with education. I think at least in the initial stages of implemented those ideas, education will be key. It will, I assume, what will not happen is that from one day to another, a government will just ban commercial animal agriculture and everyone will become vegan. That is not practical, right? That is not politically feasible. Rather, what would have to happen first is for people to get educated about the issues. We need to have the conversations, the kind of conversation we are having right now, right? That would be the first step. We need to encourage people to challenge what I call traditional morality, right? That idea that humans are superior to other animals.
Yeah.
We need to have an open debate, which is why I'm very thankful to be on your show, because I think that is the first step. And from that, we can build a political movement, which is well underway already. There is an animal rights movement. There has been for a few decades. They employ various strategies, but much of it is focused on education. I think that much I can say.
Can I request you to mute your mic when I talk so that we
Yes.
I'll do the same. So thank you, and also I thank you for agreeing to coming to the show. It's a fascinating debate, and I'm enjoying it, and I guess our audience are enjoying it too. So we are kind of running close to the end of our planned time, so it's 50 minutes already, but we still got to have at least two important areas to cover. But before that, tell me briefly, very briefly, what are the countries at the moment consider animals as being sentient?
All right, I'll keep it very brief because I want some time left to address comments and questions by the audience. We already have some like excellent questions that deserve an answer that you pulled up earlier. So let me keep it brief. So unfortunately, there is still a large number of countries in which animals don't even enjoy the minimal protection offered by anti-cruelty laws. So there are some countries that don't even have anti-cruelty laws. Forget about recognizing animal rights in the sense that I'm defending. Among the countries where animals do enjoy some legal protections, those legal protections vary significantly. There are no countries, be clear right from the start, that recognize animal rights as I'd like to see them recognized. But there has been some progress in that direction. The earliest example would be New Zealand, which, as early as 1999, banned the use of great apes in research with very few exceptions. In use, like great apes, that's gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and orangutans, our closest relatives in the animal kingdom. So those animals cannot be used in research and testing unless it benefits that individual animal or their species. So in other words, experiments that would benefit humans cannot be performed on those animals in New Zealand.
Reina, just give us the names of the countries.
Right.
Sorry to begin. I
So
don't.
that's New Zealand. So they have recognized those are not technically rights, but those are very significant protections for great apes in New Zealand. In 2013, the European Union passed similar legislation that bans great ape experimentation in most cases. Austria even went a step further. It has no exceptions whatsoever. In Austria, you cannot do harmful experimentation with great apes at all for any purpose. And then one more recent development that I would like to just mention because it's very interesting and people should look it up. There's this effort made by the so-called Non-Human Rights Project here in the United States that seeks to change the legal status of at least some non-human animals from that of property to that of persons or beings, as you put it. And they had some groundbreaking success. They got some US courts to at least give certain animals such as elephants, chimpanzees, dolphins, highly developed, like cognitively developed animals, a hearing in court. In Argentina, 2017, a court actually recognized a chimpanzee by the name of Cecilia as a legal person with rights. That was 2017. 2018, an elephant got a hearing in a court in the US. And that's the last thing I'll mention, just in May this year, a few months ago, May 2020, the Islamabad High Court, interestingly, the Islamabad High Court in Pakistan relied on arguments by the Non-Human Rights Project in the US in a decision to find that without any hesitation, that's how they put it, certain non-human animals have rights, and they ordered the release to a sanctuary of an elephant. So they recognized that elephants can have legal rights. So there's a lot happening in the area of what is called animal law. And there are efforts globally to get the rights of animals recognized by the law. And that is just beginning. And courses in animal law are now being offered in more and more universities. So it's a very exciting area that is in flux and is in development. And I encourage people to look into that also as a possible field to study for young people. It's something that will only become bigger and more important with time.
Thanks for that. So we are nearing the end of the show. I have two criticisms that I would share first. Two criticisms that generally exist against your view within the philosophical circle. And so then we'd go and address some of the audience's question, but I don't think we could be able to address all of them. But nevertheless, we try as we try our best to address the one I select. So the first one was, yeah. So the first criticism, I think, is from your friend, Professor Carl Cohen of the University of Michigan, who argued that animals do not commit crimes. Animals are not attacked for their moral views. Rights are a concept special to the human moral code. What do you say to that?
Right. So again, let me be brief because I want to talk about people's comments. And if anybody does not get a chance to get their comment or question addressed, please feel free to go to my website, send me an email, and I will respond. I'm happy to continue our conversation after this broadcast. So addressing Cohen's criticism. So it is, of course, true that non-human animals cannot understand what rights are, right? It's not part of their conceptual framework. So the concept in that sense is indeed special to humans. Animals cannot understand what rights are. They also can't respect the rights of others because they don't understand them. You cannot reason with a lion or any other predator and have a philosophical discussion like we are having right now. But neither do children, right? Yet we do not deny rights to children. Children, small children, cannot understand what rights are. You can't do philosophy with a 1-year-old. You can't have the kind of discussion we are having. A 1-year-old also does not know to respect the rights of others. And yet we do not deny rights in their case for that reason. And this is now where more philosophy comes in, right? What I was saying earlier about using logic and being consistent. So if and children can have rights even though they don't understand morality, they don't understand what rights are, and they don't respect the rights of others, then we cannot consistently deny rights to other animals because they don't understand rights and don't respect the rights of others for the reason, right? If lack of understanding is not a sufficient reason to deny rights to children, then logically it cannot be sufficient reason to deny rights to animals either. So that's
I
in a
think that's
nutshell.
a fair point. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. So, second criticism is what is known, I think, is utilitarian argument. I think you're quite versed on that argument. So it says if a healthy chimp, for example, has greater autonomy than a human with dementia, then might there be an obligation to look after the chimp ahead of the human? And or what you would say, it might be morally necessary to prevent a zebra living in the wild from being torn to shreds by a lion.
All right, thank you very much for that, because it allows me to clarify my position further, because these are very common questions, as you can imagine. And there were two questions you were asking. One about the chimp and the human being with varying degrees of autonomy. The other one was about predation in nature. So let me address each one in turn. So as for the first question, what if there were a healthy chimp who has greater autonomy than a human with, I think, dementia, you said? Now, as I've argued earlier, I don't believe that autonomy or any other mental capacity matters for basic equality, right? That that was at the core of my argument, and that I think is very important to understand. It doesn't matter to your right to life and bodily integrity, to those basic protections, whether you are more or less autonomous, whether you're more or less strong or intelligent or talented. So even if the chimp has greater autonomy, greater capacity for autonomy than some human being, that does not mean that the chimp matters more. Just like us usually having more autonomy, a higher degree of rationality, and certain other mental capacities than non-human animals, also doesn't mean that we matter more than those animals. Both chimps and humans are equally, as I've argued earlier, someone's, right? Subjects, centers of consciousness, and hence have an equal right to life. So I would treat both the chimp and the human with dementia with equal respect. Uh, and I would argue that they have the same fundamental rights. So, that being said, difference in autonomy do matter sometimes. For example, to the question of whether paternalism is justified. Children, to take that example again, are not yet autonomous to the extent you and I are, right? They are not yet fully capable of governing their own lives, including making decisions of what is good for them, which is why we are making decisions on their behalf, right? We are telling children what to do, we are preventing them from doing certain things, right? It's okay to prevent a child from eating too much chocolate, but that would not be okay with an adult who is fully capable of managing or governing his or her own life. So differences in autonomy do matter morally sometimes, for example, when it comes to deciding whether or not to tell others what to do, right? We don't do that with adults, we do it for children. But it does not matter to the basic fact that we are all morally equal. Even though it's okay to tell children what to do, that is where autonomy comes in, um, they do have the same fundamental rights you and I have. So that's how I would respond to your first question. Now, your second question is about natural predation, and that is, in fact, a challenge to animal rights theory, right? If we take the idea seriously that animals have certain fundamental rights, presumably we have an obligation to protect those rights. Just like when one human being is violating the rights of another and we are witnesses, what we're doing is we call the police, right? Typically, to protect the rights of the one who is under attack. Now, when it comes to predation in the wild, I don't think that establishing a wildlife police is the most sensible thing to do. First of all, there's an important difference between predators in the wild and us, which is we can have moral arguments, we can think about right and wrong and act accordingly, and we can lead happy and healthy lives without killing other animals. The lion can't. Neither can the lion think about matters of morality, nor can the lion survive on plant food only. So that's an important moral difference. And even if we tried to intervene in nature to prevent predation, to prevent the violation of rights in nature, I think there's a good chance we would do more damage than we would do good, because it is rarely a good idea for people to intervene in natural ecosystems. That being said, however, I don't think it's absurd to think that sometimes we are justified in intervening when one animal harms another. Think about a pet cat, right? Let's say you have a cat as a pet, and you see that cat playing with a mouse and causing suffering to that mouse. I don't think it's absurd to suggest that you, as an owner, should intervene knowing that the cat will get sufficient food at home, right? The mouse doesn't need to kill or harm the mouse for survival. It has other toys to play with, it gets enough food at home. So here, I don't think it's absurd to actually take the rights of the mouse seriously and intervene and prevent your cat from needlessly inflicting pain upon the mouse. And maybe there's other interventions we could do, either even in nature, to prevent some animal suffering, but that is complicated, and we would have to be very careful as to not cause more damage than we do good.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point and also a bit complicated argument, because um, but in because it will kind of intervene within the natural way of being, within the nature, especially to the argument that it might be morally necessary to prevent a zebra living in the wild from being shared by a lion. I mean, I think I kind of see your point that there is how much you could do policing within the natural order of things, right? I mean, that should be that is another question for another day to ponder more. So we're gonna leave it
Right.
on leave that point on this. We're not gonna talk about this anymore. We have like 5 more minutes. We don't have 5 more minutes, but we could have like 10 minutes more. And I'm gonna bring out the issues. I would want you to answer those in 1 minute per question. Okay, try, and this would be a good training. And um, so Niladri Chatterjee, it would be interesting if we can have a brief discussion, only if the time and opportunity allows for it, the concept of animal rights by the established religion. How about, Rainer, you give a summary of your understanding about what you know about how religion, or established religion. I don't know what is established religion, but I guess that's mainstream, or that few religions that people know. How about you give a summary of what you are understanding about how religions see animal rights?
So that is a huge question, of
I
course.
know.
So that will be a real challenge to answer it in 1 minute. So let me just maybe say that much. You can find values that are relevant to our relationship with other animals, such as kindness and compassion, in all major religions, I think. But at the same time, religious scriptures send very mixed messages, right? If you think about the Bible, on the one hand, there is this idea of human dominion over the animal kingdom, uh, the meaning of which is very much controversial, right? Dominion, some have interpreted it as we can use animals for our purposes, whereas others have urged us to read that line in the Bible as giving us the responsibility to care for other animals. So there's the question of how to interpret
It's
um,
a so
that
sorry.
command. But
Sorry
then
to
there's
break.
also the description of the Garden of Eden, for example, where people were vegan, right? Adam and Eve, they lived on a plant-based diet. So it seems that Christianity also communicates that is the ideal. Similarly, in heaven, we are told, right, the lion will lie next to the lamb peacefully. So there's this idea as well. And it's not just Christianity, the same in the Quran and in the Torah and in other religious scriptures. We find ideas that you could read both ways. So we're getting mixed messages. Maybe I should point out the Indian religions, Hinduism and so on, where maybe more more strongly there's an emphasis um, on equality among all sentient life, where there's the concept of ahimsa, non-violence, that many who follow Indian religions, and especially Jainism, to mention one variety, to mean that we have extensive obligations to other animals. So to summarize, it's a big issue. The message we get from the great religions are
Mixed.
mixed, and there's a lot of controversy, but there's a lot of very interesting literature. So there's arguments for and against animal rights based on religious scriptures in all major religions, and there's a huge body of literature. So if anybody's interested, you can find a lot written about that. That is very interesting and important.
Thank you. This is a quite big comment, but I think there are like several key points.
Yeah, I remember that one.
So the first point in this comment is, so if you are talking about animal rights, shouldn't it be only limited to poaching or visual tortures? That's number one. Give me a brief answer. We'll move to the second part of this question.
So part of that I already answered. Like if you read a few lines before that, the commentator is talking about survival of the fittest, but then he already gives his own answer, right? He says we have stopped that natural, like we have restrained our natural instincts in what we call civilization, right? Law prevents kidnappings. And that is because we are capable of critically evaluating our behavior in moral terms. And I think we should, since we can, which is why we have a choice in how we want to treat other animals, just like we don't allow people to violate the rights of others, even though that sometimes would be our natural instinct, right? Aggression is something that is natural to us, but we regulate aggression through laws because of our moral understanding. And I think we should do the same in our interaction with other animals. And here, I don't think we should limit our concern to visible torture or poaching, as the commentator is saying, but our interaction with other animals as a whole. We need to rethink how we eat, how we entertain ourselves, how we do science, and insofar those practices involve other animals, uh, animal rights are an important factor that we ought to consider.
Yeah,
Now, what we have not talked about yet is the second part
but
of the comment about plants.
yes, I think I know the summary of your argument. If I'm wrong, correct it. Your argument is plants do not have feelings
Correct.
comparing to animals, and I would encourage Skib to email Rainer to know more about that. We have to move on. I'm sorry about that. Um, so AKM Wahiduzzaman, he commented, until everyone's human rights are of equal importance, will ordinary people understand animal rights?
So thank you very much for that question. Also for all the other questions, the one I just answered. Because your questions allow me to further clarify my position. Now, this is a very common concern, right? So human rights are still widely violated. They are not respected universally. We still have many human rights issues that we are trying to resolve. So until we have resolved all of those, why would people care about animals? Now, one thing I would like to say, it is not an either or. Rather, the two struggles, the one for human rights and for animals rights, are interrelated. We can care about both humans and animals. And in fact, by caring for animals, we often care for humans. Animal agriculture is one of the major contributors to global warming and all kinds of other environmental destruction. So, by showing more care towards animals, by taking animal rights more seriously, we are also benefit humans. Um, Animal agriculture is a major contributor to hunger, environmental destruction. As I said, the issue we are facing right now, right, the ongoing pandemic, for example, has a lot to do with our mistreatment of animals, with our interaction of animals. The current pandemic is thought to have originated in a so-called wet market in Wuhan, where wild animals and humans are in close proximity, and the coronavirus could jump over from animals to humans. So here we're seeing a direct consequence of our treatment of, or I would say mistreatment of animals for humans. So it would be a mistake to think of those two issues as separate. Human rights and animal rights are very much connected. They are a common struggle to for respect for all sentient life, which will benefit everyone.
I think there was a good question from AKM Wahiduzzaman, and I think there was a great answer from Dr. Ebert. And it is from my friend Mabruk Darvesh. He's a Libyan scholar. He says that is that mean universal morality make the text quote unquote obsolete? and how to conclude that something is universal.
I'm not sure which text he's referring to, and I can't guess.
So
But
I, yeah.
yeah, but I can say a little bit about the idea of morality being universal. Now, it is true that that certain norms concerning our behavior are not universal, right? Table manners, as an example, it would be considered rude by many people in many countries to eat with your hands, for example, right, at a formal dinner. Whereas in Bangladesh, for example, where I go often and happily, it would not be considered rude at all. If anything, it might be considered rude to insist on a fork while everyone else is using their hands to eat. So those are customs, and they vary from context to context, from country to country. So those are not universal, like manners, matters of politeness. However, what is universal, I would argue, is the idea that people should be polite, right? That they should be well mannered. Just what it means is different from culture to culture. So there's certain fundamental values that are reflected, for example, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Those are values most people in most cultures um, share, that I think are possibly universal, where others are not. And taking the, like, distinguishing the two is one of the things that moral philosophers are trying to do, and that's what we have arguments about. Now, there's disagreement uh, across cultures, but disagreement does not mean that there is no universal truth that we might eventually arrive at. And that's why we are having those arguments, right? We're trying to figure out together across cultural and social divisions what is right and what is wrong. We will not always agree, but hopefully, as we argue and exchange ideas, we will get closer to that universal truth that may or may not be out there.
So I think Mabruk followed the question again with another question. How would you get animals to reciprocate that view?
Well, I think that has already been answered. They won't. But
Hmm.
I think reciprocity is not a condition for having rights, as we can see in the case of children. We cannot make 1-year-olds respect our rights, or people with like severe dementia or other mental conditions. But that does not stop us from respecting their rights, because we can. So I don't think reciprocity is a condition for equality or having fundamental rights. So I think we already answered that earlier. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Okay. So the the another question is from one of my students. He wants to know, does the hierarchy of animal rights, assuming a house cat has more rights compared to a wild cat, stem from our anthropocentric ideology?
So I would oppose the idea that there is or should be a hierarchy of animal rights. I argue for equality. So I think the house cat, as a matter of fact, has the same fundamental rights a wild cat has. Now, your student is right, of course, that people do give more concern to house cats than wild cats or other wild animals, right? We treat our pets very much different from how we treat mice or the animals or other animals in the wild or animals we eat. People will go to a great extent to make sure that their pets are healthy and well. They'll take them to the vet, to the doctor if they're ill. They'll make sure they're well fed. They'll make sure they're not suffering, they're not in pain. They'll protect them. There are even laws in many countries that give protections to pets that other animals do not enjoy. And I think your student is right. That has to do with our focus on humans, because those are animals with anthropocentrism, as he put it, right? That has to do with that ideology. And I think that's an ideology we should challenge because it is mistaken. Just because we care more about cats does not mean that the cat counts for more than the cow we eat, or the pig we eat, or the chicken um, we eat.
Thank you. There is another question from another student, ex-student, and I think it's an interesting one. He says, "How can animals be objects of ethics without being subjects as well?"
Well, again, I think that question has already been answered. Just like children are the objects of ethics without being the subject of ethics, so animals can be the objects of ethics without being the subject of ethics. I assume your student, by being a subject, means having moral obligations, respecting the rights of others. Animals can't do that. Non-human animals anyway can't do that. Children can't either. However, that does not stop us from recognizing that children do have certain fundamental rights. So, similarly, it should not stop us from recognizing that animals have certain fundamental rights.
So another question from Ryan. He is a former student as well. Can lab-grown meat help reduce animal cruelty?
Yes, as a practical matter, I think that is what will happen. Obviously, as a philosopher, I would hope that people are convinced by the moral argument and will stop eating meat and consuming other animal products out of moral conviction. But I think what's more realistic is to expect that the consumption of animal products will reduce because of artificially produced meat that will over time become maybe even cheaper than the meat of animals, more safe, and so on. I think that seems to be what is happening. I would prefer meat like that produced by companies like Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods to lab grown meat, though, since, as far as I understand, most lab grown meat still requires cells to be harvested from animals at the beginning of the process, which wouldn't be consistent with the idea of animal rights. But there are other alternatives. If you get a chance, try an Impossible Burger or a Beyond Burger. Those are entirely plant-based. They are not lab-grown. They're simply plant-based, but they're very close in taste and texture to real meat, or so I am told by meat eaters.
So I think we are going to conclude very soon. I just want to show one comment, but you don't have to answer because it's irrelevant to our discussion. But for the sake of the participation of the audience, I'm going to show it. So this is from Sheikh Adnan Fahad. He says, "Can you please discuss the role of Islam as a religion regarding putting an end to slavery in the then society of Arab and as well as across the world?" I think we are not discussing this topic today, and it's irrelevant. But do tune in future to see if you find a right expert to answer it. So I think this brings to an end, if I haven't missed any more comment. Okay, it's been a great show. I mean, I enjoyed this discussion very much, and thank you all from watching and commenting from all over. And please remember that we are going to hold another discussion next Friday on hate speech in Southeast Asia with Dr. James Gomez, a regional director of Asia Center in Bangkok, Thailand. With that note, I thank you warmly, Dr. Rainer Ebert, for your time and patience to address the concerns of our audience and share your knowledge to our audience. And we hope that you are going to come back and share more of your ideas in this platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you and also the audience. This was a lot of fun and I think very useful. And I think I hope we can continue this discussion at some point in the future. And I very much look forward to future episodes of this wonderful podcast.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.